Colloquium. We are starting off today with a Bioenergy 101 from DK Lee from the sustainability theme. He'll be teaching us all about field trials with his talk, Bioenergy Crop Agronomy, Miscanthus and High-Biomass Sorghum. DK?
Oh, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is DK Lee. I'm a faculty member in the Department of the Crop Science. I'm an agronomist, basically. I've been working with energy crop for entire my career. It's about 25 years, since 1999, maybe more than 25 years, actually. I've been working with energy crop in many different aspects of it, from the planting to the harvesting, and doing all kind of, ecosystem service management under the many energy crop production. While ago, Dr. Andrew Leakey, the PI of the KEBI, asked me to give a brief overview about the bioenergy crop agronomy. And basically, a lot of people never been in the field and they never, working with the agronomy aspect of the production aspect of energy crop. With that, I decided to give a presentation about the lecture about the Miscanthus and high-biomass sorghum agronomy. And before we start to the agronomy about the feedstock production, I want to talk a little bit about the feedstock, U.S. history about the bioenergy research and development. And you may be heard about the Billington study many times, but when and where, how Billington start to being around in, the research and scientific community. Back in early 2000, the U.S. Energy Advisory of the committee actually set the goal, and we should replace 30% of the current petroleum consumption as of the 2005 is actually, and this they were talking about 30%. At the time, U.S. transportation industry used about 200 billion gallon. 30% equivalent is about 60 billion gallon for the liquid fuel. And to replaces produces 60 billion liquid fuel. And at the time, we all talked about the ethanol, basically, but now we don't talk ethanol anymore. To do that, we need about 1 billion dry ton annual supply of the biomass. That was the big number. At the time, U.S. agriculture only provides about 200 million ton biomass, including everything, grain, residue stuff. Basically, five-fold increase, which was a very ambitious goal. And then DOE and USDA, a lot of government agencies start to looking at whether U.S. can produce about 1 billion dry ton biomass. And then they did a study based on crop yield improvement every year, and then technology adoption of the new technology. And they reported the 2005 first billion ton report. And the billion ton report basically talked about over 1 billion dry biomass we can supply annually if we adopted like a no-till for everybody and adapted the big acres of the perennial dedicated energy crop. Since that, basically DOE published the 3 more updated version of a billion ton study, and 2011 was the second one, and 2016 was the third one. Recently, 2023 billion ton study, they just reported it. And in 2023, Billington study actually reported, updated a lot and a lot more detail specific. Basically, U.S. agricultural land is responsible for over about 650 million dry ton biomasses, basically. And, perennial purpose grown energy crop, what we simply call the energy crop, basically has a huge role to provide that, those 650 million ton biomasses. Looking at here, actually this category and this category we call the energy crop, and which is purpose-grown energy crop. I think a purpose-grown energy crop is the first term in DOE start using in 2023 billion ton study until that point, and then we use a dedicated energy crop. In purpose-grown energy crop, within a purpose-grown energy crop, there's about herbaceous energy crop, which is very important, and over 2/3 of the overall agricultural feedstock has to come from herbaceous. And herbaceous, and typically we are talking about non-woody crop, which is a switchgrass, a miscanthus, and the energy cane, and high-biomass sorghum. And as a DOE think, or nation, we think that those herbaceous energy crops is very important because they are not competing with the food production, or land. They are not competing for, any row crop or human food production. And also they are really typically very high water and nutrient efficiency, especially at very low agronomic input required. And then also as a perennial nature, they provide a lot of ecosystem service benefit. With that, we are really going to I'm going to talk about the, herbaceous or the purpose grown energy crop. And within a herbaceous or purpose grown energy crop, we can divide into two different categories. First one is annual and then perennial. And within a KB, we work with both annual and perennial. And perennial side, we work with the Miscanthus and energy cane. And also annual side, we work with the High-Biomass Sorghum. And just looking at their growth and development, and perennial annual is very different in terms of the agronomic management and input wise. As the annual crops that complete their life cycle within a year, and planting to the harvesting all happen in very, very short time period. And establishment is relatively easy, and it doesn't take much effort since we do have all well-established agronomic practice. But one downside about the annual, I mean, they only cover ground is less than 6 months out of the 12 months each growing season. And also their input is fairly heavy. And the two most common annual crop I can think about, other than corn, soybean, I think a high biomass sorghum for the Midwestern Great Plain region. And also recently, a lot of people interested about, intermediate oil crop, which is a lot of winter oilseed crop in this area. I mean, KB hasn't got into the winter oilseed crop research, but recently, and KB leadership team visited with the cover crop, which is domesticated the pennycress, winter oilseed crop, and also there's a lot of conversation about the camelina as a winter oil crop too. I believe that has a great potential, especially we do have a large acre corn soybean rotation. Basically, we can plant winter oilseed crop between the corn and soybean during the off-season of the corn soybean production. Other than that, and the other side is perennial. Perennial is actually, which is a perennial, right? Even though they're complete the life cycle each year, but you don't have to plant again and again because it's a perennial nature. They completed their life cycle each in the fall, and as they going through the senescence, but next spring they come in again. And with this perennial nature, the establishment is quite challenging. All the perennial we are dealing with, and the establishment process is very slow. But once established, you don't have to worry about the establishment planting again. But establishment is the biggest challenge for this perennial energy crop. But the other side, once established, their input requirement is very minimal. That's the good benefit about the perennial energy crop, actually. And two species I'm going to talk to today is Miscanthus and perennial, and the high biomass sorghum is annual. Actually, high biomass sorghum it's biannual in tropical environment, which is native to the Africa. But this temperate region, it acting like an annual because they are not winter hardy, and they finish the life cycle at the end each end of the each years. Well, Miscanthus, which is a natural hybrid between diploid Miscanthus sinensis and then tetraploid Miscanthus saccharophorus. I believe that's correct. I don't remember. It's been a while. Anyway, and a hybrid between diploid and then tetraploid. And this is natural hybrid, the triploid, which is a sterile, adiploidy. And make it, the sterile Miscanthus does not produce the seed, which is good and bad. And we don't have to worry about invasiveness because it's a non-native exotic species. But planting as agronomist, it could be challenged because our industry is used to plant a seed and not for the propagule. And that's the biggest challenge. Okay. But as you see, this Miscanthus left side, I believe that was planted in 2009 at the energy farm, small square, and still growing. And every year, I believe this picture was taken recently, but I think it's somewhere around the end of August or early September before they're hitting the flowering. I think somewhere around the 2 meter, which is almost 10 feet high. But versus the sorghum, which is my graduate stand by this high-biomass sorghum was planted end of May or early June, by the time August, which is only like a 2.5 months, 3 months, they can reach up to the 15 feet tall. It's crazy crop. I mean, by far the most productive plant, and I'm dealing with in this Midwestern environment is actually they can produce high biomass. But looking at their growth calendars, you can see the very different, right? In the top, Miscanthus is year-round, in the whole entire 12 year, they cover the ground, whether it's by the residue or by the above ground vegetative. Typical life cycle, they start to green up and some around in April. Some year depends on the temperature. Emergence are all based on temperature, ground soil temperature. And then I see the some miscanthus start in end of March too. But typically mid-April to the late April, they start emerging out of the ground and they go through the rapid growth phase, but assuming that's after establishment. But the planting year could be very different. I'm going to talk to a little later. But once they emerge out of the ground, they go really quickly, and then their canopies close completely by the end of May, and they reach, plant the height about 10 feet and mid-July or early August. And then they start the flowering in September. They go through the senescence process by the October and November. But senescence is very important for the miscanthus as a perennial because they are translocated all the above ground, the nutrient to the below ground, the rhizome structure, and they can support next year growth without giving too much, adding too much, input actually. And typically in the Midwest, and especially Illinois, we not recommend harvesting in the fall. I mean, because they are not completely turning to the brown until killing frost, which is hard to frost happen in late October. And, if we do harvest it before the killing frost or completion of the senescence, we can harm the stem health basically. And also we like to have some ground cover through the winter, and the miscanthus can be protected by the, above ground for this harsh winter. Otherwise, they can be killed during the fluctuation of a low temperature, which can be serious problem for the long-term, production of the miscanthus actually. And many regions, and also we don't want to have a harvest overlap with the corn soybean production. I think we'd like to have a little off season after complete of the corn soybean harvesting. And then typically in the energy farm, we harvest the miscanthus come around February and March, which is no other really conflict with the no other harvest. They give us a nice the working window and labor distribution too. By the time when we harvest the miscanthus in the spring, early spring, we did just the last weeks in energy farm miscanthus harvesting, and there's no leaf attached onto the stem. Basically, we are pretty much harvesting stem only, which is good because all the nutrient is highly concentrated nutrient in the leaf section drop going back to the field too actually. Versus the sorghum as an annual crop, it's very different. It's only like maybe maximum 5 months from June through the September. Early October we're harvesting, and we typically plant in the late May or early June, depending on how busy farmer are. And typically we're not sacrificing corn soybean planting. In a sorghum, always we planted after corn soybean planting is complete. Still fine actually. And then we plant it typically May, and then about 1 month there's a juvenile development. It's kind of slow. After that they take really quickly. You maybe see that every day they growing 1 inch or 2 inch per day. And then by the time in mid-August, and they already reached the 10 feet. And then once, mid-September, they reach up to the 15 feet, actually. I'm going to talk about the photoperiod sensitivity. Before they flower, they keep growing until mid-September. And then we are harvesting green tissue, not the dry tissue or brown tissue, because they never go to the senescence in this temporal region, and we harvest the green tissue. And it can be challenging for this Midwestern practice. Just talked about the miscanthus agronomy a little bit. I think everybody understand asexual propagation. Asexual propagation means it's just not propagated by the seed or reproductive unit. It's basically we are harvesting below ground stem tissue, which we call specifically rhizome, and we harvest the rhizome and plant rhizome. Guess what? Rhizome in the below, this is AI generated picture. It's not really good, but I think this is more like a rhizome looks like this or this like this. And then very irregular shape. And then each rhizome has at least 2 or 3 buds, which eventually going to be in the tiller and after they emerge in the spring. But those rhizome shapes and size is very irregular. And then planting those rhizome is require very specific equipment. And a lot we are adapting from horticultural, crop planting equipment, but it's not very common in the Midwest. Obviously, it's a much slow process and the equipment is hard to find around here too. And the other hand, we can actually use a plug planting, which is plug is actually developed in the greenhouse using the rhizome. And then obviously they already developed the root structure. And then, just to guarantee the establishment much more uniformly and evenly. But it's require have a specific equipment also, and also need the time period, the resource for the greenhouse propagate, propagate preparation. And the rain moisture is critical, more critical for the plug. It's actually. But by the way, I mean whether it's you plant the rhizome or a plug, which are not seed, and they require much more intense moisture management during the establishment period of the first years, actually, which is very different from annual crop we plant to seed, is actually right. During the growing season, and once it's established, it's fairly easy to manage. It's maybe not much, management practice requirements. Basically, they are very highly efficient in terms of use of nitrogen water. But I don't know, they are really efficient in terms of the water and nitrogen, or they are just very capable because they have a established, developed below ground structure, and then very deep root system, and they can find the water very deep in the soil profile and also nutrient too. It's actually very minimal. At this moment, it's a perennial weed, right? It's a perennial grass. They are very resistant, tolerant to any insect and pest infestation too, actually. And then during the establishment, it's a weed management is somewhat challenging, but once after you go through the establishment period, relatively easy, as long as you have a good management practice. The management practice I'm talking about is more about the harvesting. Harvest management has to be, right time. We talked about the late fall or following winter's best. If you harvest the green tissue, you can kill miscanthus very quickly. Any perennial you harvest the wrong time of the year, especially when it's green, it can harm very severely, and then they can be, very struggle to come out of the harvest damage shocks, actually. But one thing we learned for the long-term production of the miscanthus is soil fertility management. You maybe heard about the miscanthus required a very little amount of nitrogen or the nutrient. That is true, but still, it's a plant, right? It's a green plant. They do the photosynthesis. They still need the nutrient. If nutrient management is not well done, and the miscanthus can have a, reduce the biomass yield, and their production can be severely actually can have a problem. Is actually based on our long-term observation at the energy farm. I'm talking about all the biomass yield is in here. I'm talking about actual practical scale, not the small scale. This is a true scale we are talking about. This is all biomass yield is combined through the large combine commercial scale, which might be very different from number you saw in the literature, which can be collected from small scale too. It's very different. And the two thing we found after 15 years of miscanthus production in the soil, P&K, the concentration decrease available, P&K decreases severely, which means the miscanthus mine the P&K for biomass production, above ground biomass production, especially we are harvesting removable biomass. And another interesting thing is obviously the increasing of the soil carbon, soil organic matter, and also increasing total nitrogen. But a lot of nitrogen is actually bounded into soil organic matter below ground tissue. It's not necessarily available for the plant growth, which require the annual supply of the nitrogen. And then looking at the long-term biomass yield, and the miscanthus planted in energy farm 2009, and until 2013, we have not put any nitrogen. And then we start to see 3 or 4 years after production, we start to see the biomass yield is declining. And then energy farm and the leadership decide to put a 50-pound nitrogen, which is the black bar showing here, and then we see the bounce back, then biomass yield. But that didn't take many years. About 5 to 7 8 years, Miscanthus biomass yield started declining again. And then we initiated some of the more study. We're adding more nitrogen and including and then P and K. As we do in the last 3 years, and the Miscanthus yield start taking up again. I strongly believe agronomists, it's farming and plant is a plant. They need a nutrient, right? I think we understand some aging effect is true, but I think the aging effect is we are really talking about the biological aging effect or just a depletion of the nutrient in soil. We still need to fine tune, but I'm betting about 70% soil nutrient deficiency depletion and maybe 30% associated with some of the aging effect. But as you see, sometimes yield is declining big time. Here, 2013 and 14, 18 and 19 without nitrogen. And again, here, 22. This is actually happened in the winter kill, I believe. That's the year. And I talked to Dr. Eric Sag about it, 2013 and 14. We have a severe winter. There's a severe winter kill. It's not completely killed, but there is severe winter kill and then reduce the tiller density big time that reduces the biomass yield. And personally, we did the 2018 and 19. We experienced the same thing. As you see the big yield dip in the 2018 to 19. And then again happened here. And then they start to really bounce back again here. If we have a severe winter again, it can go down again. I think the main thing is just a lot of the tiller in the near close to the surface area got killed by the cold winter too, actually. But one other thing we learned, if we do the soil fertility management well, and then winter kill is actually minimal. If plant is not strong and healthy, they get more winter kill, just like a human being, right? You have a good healthy condition and layer of the clothing, winter clothing, you can go over the winter very well. But I think it's plant the same way too, actually. And then once all the management and years goes well, typically, and in the perennial, because it's one thing very different from perennial, different from annual, because they are very resilient. And if drought situation really hard, the annual crop can be really struggle. I remember in 2012 was bad drought year. We see the little dip, otherwise a bit little higher. And 2000 years of bad drought and corn soybean yield down to 50% of in state average in that. But the perennial didn't have much hit by the big drought. That's it's the nature of the perennial. And it typically goes well. And then after the Miscanthus yield reach maximum biomass yield, the potential yield typically happen in second or third year when we start harvesting. And each year we're just watching, and then we wait until they complete finishing the complete of the senescence, and then we start to thinking about the harvesting. Typically, we do harvest again in February and March, and then there's no leaf. We're just harvesting stem tissue only. There's a lot of residue on the surface, especially leaf residue. And then one good thing about the Miscanthus, we only harvest the stem tissue, and also completion of several months after the completion of the senescence, the moisture content is low. I mean, we talked about the less than 20%. Ideally, we'd like to have a 15% moisture, less than 15% or less. Then we can bale, we can store. If moisture has more than 50%, we cannot store this bale. But Miscanthus, typically we harvest less than 10% in February and March, which is very ideal. We don't harvest the moisture. I mean, not only about the storage. If you harvest the 20% moisture, you have to deal with a lot more mass in just water, which is we don't need it actually. And then you can bale and store for until we can process it. And you may not know what's going on in the field scale baling and harvesting. Harvesting and baling. This is not the Miscanthus. This is one of the switchgrasses. The only video I can find for the switchgrass. You see the haybine, which is New Holland haybine. They can windrow it, and then they can bale same day as the moisture is less than 15%. That's the typical process of the harvesting of the biomass, which can be very different from grain harvesting of corn and soybean too, actually. Switchgrass is a little different than Miscanthus. They do have an intact leaf, and the typical moisture is around 12 to 15%. But Miscanthus, we don't harvest the leaf, and then moisture is much lower. High-Biomass sorghum, which is annual, very different. I think this is AI generated picture, but it's very similar, which can be the 3 times taller, than me, and 15 feet tall. It's annual, but this is a hybrid also between the grain sorghum and sweet sorghum. Texas A&M Bill Rooney developed this photoperiod sensitive biomass sorghum, which they are not initiating flower until 12-hour, 15-minute day length. And 12-hour day lengths happen in fall equinox, which is September 21st, which means sorghum never flower in Champaign, Illinois. By the time 12-hour or long initiating, somewhere around the mid-September, they initiate the flower, but they need another month to have it come out of it. And then we get the frost until that point, and by the time. But it's very drought tolerant, and then it's growing really, really fast, and then they can accumulate biomass all the way to the growing season. Basically, this photoperiod hybrid is designed to accumulate biomass until frost without developing grain as actually. Right, and in sorghum, we already had well-developed agronomy practice, and the planting and herbicide weed control relatively easy. We do have a good herbicide program. Other than that, it just need some management about the soil nutrients, which require pretty significant amount, even though much less than corn, but they still need nitrogen and fertilizer too. It's annual, right? It's only 5 months after they're starting, and we can harvest it. But remember, Miscanthus, we harvest it after completion of the senescence, but we are harvesting this as a green tissue before the frost. And then large biomass. Another biggest problem we are dealing with the Miscanthus harvest, the people sometimes asking people, hey, DK, how do you bale the sorghum? No, we can't bale sorghum because they contain over 70% moisture. Some year, depends on the fall condition, it can up to 80% moisture. Basically, you harvested 1 ton biomass, basically, 800 the kilo is water. It's basically. 16,000 pounds is water is actually. 1,600 pounds is water, 200 pounds is the biomass. We are just harvesting a lot of moisture. And we're looking at the bale, just chopping and blowing into the wagon. We see the combine is bleeding the green juices actually. And this biomass cannot be stored. It has to be processed right away. And that's the big challenge for the Midwestern high biomass sorghum production. It is not the agronomy challenge. It's more about the logistic challenge. It's very different from perennial energy crop. It's actually. Just looking at the biomass yield, I'm talking about very practical scale about the biomass yield of Miscanthus. This is a maximum yield potential. What we get, that's actually 10 to 15 megagram per hectare, somewhere around the 5 ton per acre, and that's the typical Miscanthus yield we are getting. Versus the sorghum, obviously, even they are very much water hog, but they can produce up to 10 ton biomass per acre. It's much more. They can produce a lot more biomass yield actually. But nutrient-wise, obviously big difference. Miscanthus require a lot less nutrient because they don't remove much nutrient. It's actually typically you harvest the Miscanthus tissue, analyze the nitrogen content, concentration about 0.2% is actually versus the sorghum you can harvest up to 5%. As you harvesting green tissue. And also sorghum is typically, it's coming from the sweet sorghum family, the genetic, they can take a lot of potassium too. They are really taking lots of potassium, but still nitrogen use is much lower than corn. Typical Illinois corn farmer applying over 200 pounds of nitrogen. Typically about 240 pounds of nitrogen. But nitrogen we are applying here is about 120 pounds, depends on previous crops. It's still, but it's a lot more significantly more than actually Miscanthus. Here, people might ask about 20 pounds nitrogen, Miscanthus removed. Why we need more nitrogen? Because a lot of nitrogen actually bounded into the organic matter in the Miscanthus field. That's something we don't really 100% sure what's the best nitrogen management is actually. All right, looking at obviously end of the day, we are using this feedstock for the conversion. Whether you are producing liquid fuel, whether you are producing a high value bioproduct, you need a carbon based material, right? I mean, all together, cellulose and hemicellulose lignin is a carbon compound. Hemicellulose and then cellulose is a carbohydrate, but lignin is non-carbohydrate carbon compound. But depends on the technology, conversion technology, we can convert all the carbon compound to some bio-based product. A huge difference between miscanthus and sorghum, their composition quite different. As a miscanthus, we are not much harvesting other than cellulose and hemicellulose lignin. Versus the sorghum, we are harvesting a lot of non-carbohydrate compound, the carbon compound, which is, I mean, it can be water, I mean, soluble carbon too, but a lot of salt and different minerals and a lot of those things. And composition is very different. If you're just looking at, non-structural carbohydrate, high concentration, miscanthus is much easier, better feedstock. But depends on the application. The sorghum biomass could be very different. Thing is just, but they have a lot more carbon compound in their biomass. It depends on the application. Yep. I want to wait too long. I don't know. If you have any question, I think that's my last slide. If you have any question, I can answer it. Yes, go ahead.
Uh, Sort of thinking more broadly, you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. For these perennial systems, they do eventually sort of like age and they'll start to decelerate growth. Thinking from like a prairie ecosystem landscape, like especially where if you have like a lot of herbivores that would sort of like run through and they would like tear the land apart, is part of the issue just that if you have these perennial systems where the soil isn't sort of being like turned over regularly, that eventually they'll just sort of like locally exhaust? And is that sort of the issue that you're kind of running into in like an
I think
agronomics?
we have to think about the perennial ecosystem. Perennial prairie is not really farming ground. But miscanthus and switchgrass, whatever it's a perennial system we are dealing with, it's a farming ground. Big difference whether you remove the biomass or not. All the farming practice, we are removing above ground biomass. Perennial system, they just keep recycling within a system. And also in a perennial system, you have a lot of different species there, including legume species, and they can fix their own nitrogen and they cycle. And but in the agronomy system, farming land is not that way. But another big thing about the yield potential, perennial prairie never had a high yield potential compared to the miscanthus or switchgrass we are growing for the biomass yield. The yield potential is different, but sustainability or resilience of the perennial system, I mean, prairie system much higher, but their yield potential is always lower than actually compared to the perennial we are dealing with. Yeah.
Thank you.
No question. Okay. Thank you.